What would you do if your life savings vanished overnight? In 1931, that nightmare became reality for millions of Europeans when Austria's largest bank collapsed, the first domino that would bring the continent to its knees. While everyone remembers America's breadlines and Wall Street chaos, what did Europe's Great Depression look like? Cities that had barely recovered from World War I now faced a new enemy: complete economic devastation. Over the course of the crisis, 1 in 5 workers lost their jobs, banks collapsed, and European trade plummeted by over 66%. But what caused Europe to spiral from post-war recovery into financial ruin? Buckle up as we uncover the chaos and economic turmoil behind Europe's Great Depression. Let's start in the early 1920s. Europe was a continent rebuilding from the ashes of World War I, having to reconstruct factories, farms, and homes. Europe's industry lagged behind an increasingly productive United States. The average US factory worker now produced twice as much per hour as their European counterpart. World War I had also left economies shattered by debt from reparations obligations and would see traumatized populations with hunger and hyperinflation. Desperate for stability and recovery, European nations leaned heavily on help from Uncle Sam, with American banks becoming Europe's ATM. The Dawes Plan of 1924 restructured German reparations and opened the floodgates of US loans into Europe. The US lent out $4 billion to Germany, and Europe as a whole received roughly $7.8 billion between 1924 and 1930. While American money propped up Europe, currency stability became the holy grail. The nightmare of early 1920s hyperinflation in the Weimar Republic was seared into public memory.
Morning, ya! Just taking my salary to buy a loaf of bread. Sorry, the price just doubled while you walked here. How about now? Tripled during our conversation.
See this? Unlike paper that you can print endlessly, gold is finite. You can't just make more of it.
Our marks became wallpaper.
But this has held its value for centuries. No printing press can devalue it.
Well, back to the gold standard then. Yes, a mark backed by gold can never become worthless.
The shared fixation for consistency and stability drove a return to the gold standard. By the mid-1920s, Britain, France, Italy, and many others tied their currencies to gold, hoping to create financial trust. But this stability came at a cost. To maintain gold pegs, governments had to balance budgets, suppress wages to keep labour costs matching falling prices, and hike interest rates if gold flowed out. These rigid rules proved crippling during crises, effectively handcuffing Europe as disaster loomed. Yet, despite these challenges, parts of Europe saw prosperity in the Roaring '20s. Factories hummed in Berlin and Paris. Germany grew through US loans. France rebounded after the stabilization of its franc. Europe's recovery remained fragile, hindered by farm overproduction, shaky banks, and war debts. However, this fragile recovery wouldn't last, and in 1929, things would take a turn for the worse. When America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. In October 1929, Wall Street crashed, and the shockwave hit Europe hard. US investors and banks filled with fear began calling in their loans. Europe lost its American lifeline that it had come to heavily rely on.
Time to pay up, folks. But I just used your loans to pay France. And I'll use that to pay Britain.
Who used it to pay you? As economic uncertainty set in, nations scrambled to save themselves. And in 1930, America fired the first shot with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, slamming the door on European goods. Europe retaliated in a panic. France imposed quotas on over 3,000 products. Germany hiked tariffs by 50%, and even Britain, the champion of free trade for 85 years, abandoned its stance. The world shut down in hostile economic blocs. For everyday farmers and miners, it was a death sentence. And just when things looked like they couldn't get any worse, European banks began to fall. In May 1931, Creditanstalt, Austria's mighty financial pillar, announced insolvency. Alarm bells rang throughout the continent. If big banks could fail, Who was safe? Depositors stormed branches demanding money that wasn't there, which created bank runs. By July 1931, Germany's Danette Bank collapsed. By summer 1931, the Hungarian National Bank's depleted foreign exchange reserves forced the government to suspend both bond redemptions and foreign interest payments.
Austria, are you good? I just need a moment.
Tell me you're still liquid?
I'm not technically insolvent if no one checks.
Nations faced a nightmare choice. Stick to the gold standard, where the currency remained stable, but governments couldn't stimulate the economy during hard times, and were required to raise interest rates, cut spending, and crush wages to defend the currency. Alternatively, they could abandon the gold standard for a floating currency, allowing the central bank to adjust interest rates and the money supply freely to stimulate the economy, but at the risk of excessive money printing and high inflation. Many countries, including Germany, chose to maintain the gold standard at first. Germany's Chancellor, Heinrich Brüning, became the grim symbol of this era. He slashed unemployment benefits, raised taxes, and cut wages, all while 6 million Germans lost their jobs. His policies strangled the economy. Industrial output plunged 40%. People called him the Hunger Chancellor. Desperate citizens listened to new voices. Communists promising revolution, Nazis vowing revenge. It seemed that a continental crisis was inevitable. Britain entered the 1930s already wounded. Its coal, steel, and shipbuilding industries were decaying. When the Depression hit, unemployment soared to 20%, or over 2.5 million people. The Jarrow March of 1936 saw endless columns of jobless men march 300 miles to London and became a symbol of a nation's despair. However, here's where Britain's story diverged from that of the continent. In September 1931, with gold reserves bleeding away, it made the unthinkable decision. It abandoned the gold standard. The pound sank like a stone, dropping 23%. After leaving gold, the national government coalition slashed interest rates to historic lows. Reluctantly, it also abandoned free trade, shielding its industries that were hit with tariffs while favouring trade within the empire, allowing exports to recover. These moves, combined with a cheaper pound, slowly stabilised the British economy. While extremists seized power elsewhere on the continent, Britain's institutions bent but didn't break. The same couldn't be said for Germany and Italy. The two countries walked parallel paths into darkness, marked by economic ruin, democratic collapse, and rebirth through dictatorship. Germany suffered immensely. By 1932, unemployment had reached 6 million, nearly one-third of the workforce. In industrial towns, half the workforce idled. Chancellor Brüning's austerity had backfired catastrophically. Extremist Nazis and communists dominated elections. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Democracy died within months. The Nazis poured money into rearmament and propaganda projects. The Autobahn highways, tanks and fighter planes. By 1936, unemployment vanished, on paper. But workers now laboured for the state, building instruments of war. Italy followed the same script, minus the election. Mussolini, already a dictator since the 1920s, had crippled Italy by overvaluing the lira on the gold standard. When the Depression hit, industries imploded. Mussolini's answer? Total state control. In 1933, he established the IRI, a government holding company that acquired failing banks and industries. Jobs came from conquest. The 1935 invasion of Ethiopia provided stimulus through arms factories and military recruitment. Both nations traded freedom and civil rights for a grim, militarized recovery. Unlike the other nations, France recognized the Depression late and paid a heavy price for its complacency. Its banks held less US debt, and a larger agricultural sector provided a buffer. Through 1930, France felt insulated. Stubbornly clinging to the gold standard while others devalued it, France priced itself out of the world market. Deflation set in. Prices and profits tumbled. Unemployment rose, fueling unrest. Politics descended into chaos. 6 governments rose and fell between 1931 and 1935. In February 1934, far-right rioters nearly toppled the Republic. Society was split between fascist leagues and militant communists. Finally, in 1936, voters handed power to the left-wing Popular Front. Prime Minister Léon Blum launched a quiet revolution, introducing the 40-hour workweek, mandatory paid vacations, and wage hikes. For the first time, French workers gained paid holidays, heading to the beaches instead of barricades. France also abandoned gold, but business elites put an end to the experiment. Capital fled, investment froze, and by 1938 the Popular Front collapsed. France entered World War II divided, demoralized, and economically weaker than it had been in 1929.
My biggest bank collapsed. We're running on fumes and prayer. Wheat prices tanked. 40% of industry gone.
Authoritarianism's back. It's cheaper than reform. We dumped the monarchy, tried democracy, and now we're gearing up for civil war. By the late 1930s, Europe's depression eased, not through cooperation, but through the grim threat of war. Large-scale rearmament in Europe, the Far East, and eventually the United States after 1939 finally absorbed the excess industrial capacity that had remained idle since 1929. Unemployment fell, but the cost was a continent arming for annihilation. The Depression's true devastation was political. Europe was already weak, and with the Great Depression, faith in democracy and capitalism evaporated. When moderates offered only hunger and hopelessness, millions embraced extremists, offering scapegoats and swift solutions. International cooperation died. Tariffs became weapons. Beggar-thy-neighbour currency devaluations to boost a country's exports at the expense of its trade partners had poisoned relations. The League of Nations, founded to prevent war, proved helpless against economic collapse. A weakened, fractured Europe could not resist aggression. Britain and France, economically exhausted, appeased Hitler, partly because war seemed unaffordable. Germany, rebuilt through militarism, craved conquest. The road from depression to Dachau was tragically short. After 1945, the lessons were etched in blood. New institutions rose, the IMF to stabilize currencies, the World Bank to rebuild, and the European Economic Community, which later became the EU, to bring old foes together. The gold standard was buried. Keynesian economics, which utilized government spending to combat recessions, became the prevailing approach. The Great Depression was a harsh teacher that provided valuable lessons that we can learn from. Financial stability and international cooperation aren't boring bureaucratic ideas. They're what stand between us and the kind of collapse that ravaged an entire generation. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out our previous video covering the Great Depression in America and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. And we will see you guys next time.